Please welcome Max Boot and George Packer.
Well, welcome to all of you, and it's truly a privilege for me to be able to talk with a writer I admire as much as I do George about a book that I admire as much as I do his book, Our Man, about Richard Holbrooke. I'm not going to give a lengthy introduction of George, who I hope needs no introduction, but he is quite simply one of the preeminent journalists in America, certainly one of the preeminent practitioners of long-form journalism, now at The Atlantic, previously for many years at The New Yorker, winner of the National Book Award, finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, also recent winner of the Hitchens Prize, which we may get a chance to talk about towards the end of our conversation.
Thank you, Max, and the feeling is mutual.
Thank you very much. All right, we're not going to spend too much time complimenting each other. We're going to jump right into the meat of the discussion. So this book is called Our Man, Richard Holbrooke and the End of the American Century. And let me do my best Brian Lamb imitation and begin by asking you, who was Richard Holbrooke?
You really need to ask, because somehow while he was alive, it seemed like he was one of the most famous people in the country, and his reputation, his name had faded because history and time are ruthless, and even someone of Holbrooke's stature is forgotten, and he risked being forgotten. He was an American diplomat, but he was also a celebrity, and which is a rare combination. He served under every Democratic president from John F. Kennedy to Barack Obama. So his career spanned 50 years of America as a superpower, including the decade after the Cold War ended as the only superpower in the world. And the major events of his career were three wars. Vietnam, when he was a 22-year-old junior Foreign Service officer who was posted to the Mekong Delta in 1963, more as an aid worker and pacification advisor than as a diplomat. And so he saw the war right up close at ground level, where it was at its very hottest in 63. Vietnam consumed him for his first decade in public life. He was Jimmy Carter's Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia at the tender age of 35, participated in the normalization of relations with China, tried to normalize relations with Vietnam, but failed, and got into brutal bureaucratic fistfights with Zbigniew Brzezinski and others. He was a combative and aggressive infighter. The peak of his career came in the 90s. The second war of his life was Bosnia, and that was the war that Holbrooke really should get credit for negotiating to an end, because it was bleeding away in the heart of Europe for years, and no European seemed able to stop it, and America didn't want to have anything to do with it, and Holbrooke pushed and pushed until he finally got Clinton to send him to negotiate with the Balkan warlords, and he brought them together at Dayton, Ohio, to sign a peace accord. His career ended, and his life ended under Obama, who he had a very unhappy relationship with. He was the special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. So the third war of his life was Afghanistan, which in many ways brought him back to the first, because it had so many echoes of Vietnam. And he tried to use the insights of that long experience to advise Obama. Obama didn't really want to hear it for a lot of reasons. Holbrooke pushed all the wrong buttons in Obama. Holbrooke's major insight was that we need to negotiate with the enemy if we're ever going to end this war. We cannot do it simply by pouring in more troops. And that was not a message that was very popular in the early Obama years, and Holbrooke died in Hillary Clinton's office, or at least the event that caused his death happened while he was sitting in the Secretary of State's office, which was where he had always wanted to be and had never made it. And the main reason was himself, which we can talk about. his face turned this shade of red, and Hillary Clinton said, "My God, Richard, what's happening to you?" His aorta had just ruptured, and he was rushed to a hospital. The last hour of his life, which I describe in second-by-second detail as much as I could, was the hour in which he was more Holbrooke than ever, and he died after 20 hours of surgery. So in some ways, the end of his life had a kind of tragic quality to it.
Now, what was your own relationship with Holbrooke, and why did you decide to write this book?
Well, Brian,
You know, I will pause here and say I have done been interviewed many times by many different people over the years, and I have to say, in many ways, Brian Lamb was actually the toughest because he asked the most basic questions. He would say, "What is that on your wrist?
Yeah.
How does that work?
Right.
Why are you wearing it?"
And you'd have to
it's
think
like,
about-
you're like, wait, that's so basic, it never even occurred
Right.
to me. But anyway, go
no,
ahead.
but it's the right question.
Yeah.
So I knew him a bit. He cultivated journalists. He loved journalists. He had wanted to be a journalist when he was young. He didn't get the job of his dreams at the New York Times, and so he said, "The hell with it, I'm going to go join the State Department." This was in '62. But he never lost that love of journalism and kind of the impulse of journalism. He always wanted, rather than to get briefed in an air-conditioned building, to be on the ground, seeing for himself. So he liked being around them, and he also manipulated them quite well and cultivated them in order to burnish his own legend, which was very powerful in his own mind. So I became one of those. I resisted. You have to resist, but you also get seduced a little bit. And in the end, I wrote a profile of him in the very last 2 years of his life for The New Yorker when he was working on Afghanistan. Not a work I particularly am proud of, but that became my entree into getting to know him a bit. He died before I really knew him very well. So it was the relation of a kind of a friendly wariness between the great man and the scribe. Why did I write a book about him? Because right after he died, I became aware that he had left behind these papers. This was in December 2010. That his widow suggested had all kinds of interesting material, letters and diaries, and it's rare that in the sort of the freshness of a life that's just gone out, you are aware of a trove of material that no one knows about. And so I asked her, without any idea of why, "Would you let me have them? No strings, no conditions, to write a book."
This is Katie Martin.
Katie Martin, a writer in her own right, a very, a woman, a formidable woman who wasn't just going to, toss them away, but who I guess had enough faith in me that she said yes. So within a week, maybe a month after his death, a moving van was crossing the East River over the Brooklyn Bridge from Tribeca, where his office was, to my little home office in Brooklyn. And so for 7 years, these giant black filing cabinets sat in my home office full of the life's archive of Richard Holbrooke. And that became my burden and my opportunity. And it was many years before I figured out how to turn it from a burden into an opportunity, because it wasn't immediately clear. And there were many times when I regretted having taken it on and wondered why the hell I had let these filing cabinets into my office so that I couldn't even get the door all the way open.
I want to ask you why you wrote it the way that you did, but first I want to give the folks in the audience a sense of how you wrote it. So I'm wondering if you would do us the favor of reading the first paragraph or two of the book.
Holbrooke, yes, I knew him. I can't get his voice out of my head. I still hear it saying, "You haven't read that book? You really need to read it." Saying, "I feel, and I hope this doesn't sound too self-satisfied, that in a very difficult situation where nobody has the answer, I at least know what the overall questions and moving parts are." Or saying, "Gotta go, Hillary's on the line." That voice, calm, nasal, a trace of older New York, a sing-song cadence when he was being playful, but always doing something to you, cajoling, flattering, bullying, seducing, needling, analyzing, one-upping you, applying continuous pressure, like a strong underwater current. so that by the end of a conversation, even 2 minutes on the phone, you found yourself far out from where you'd started, unsure how you got there, and mysteriously exhausted. I don't think I should read more. We should just keep talking.
Well, I think
that's the
I think it gives you a flavor of it, and it's a very unusual way to start a biography, as I can personally attest, having just written a biography which did not start this way. He begins, Holbrooke, yes, I knew him. And throughout the book, you're very conversational. You're almost kind of breaking the third wall, and this almost as if this were Tristram Shandy or something like that, addressing the reader in a way that biographers don't normally do. So I'm curious, was that your intent from the start, or how did you stumble? Because I think it's just as another writer, I think what you did is brilliant and unconventional, and I think it worked because it really, and as also, I might add, as somebody who actually knew Holbrooke as well, and like you was sometimes seduced by him, or at least cultivated by him, I thought, man, this is the guy that I knew in all his complexity. But you really, I think, conveyed that with this very kind of personal writing style, which kind of makes you a character in the book as well, in a good sense, not an Edmund Morris sense.
Well, thank you. This was the key to getting it to stop being a burden. And when I say a burden, I mean you're just crushed by the weight of someone's life and every bit of information that you feel you need to uncover and everyone you need to talk to. And you begin to wonder why. Is this like an encyclopedia? What is the purpose of putting this on readers who, by the time I'm done, may have forgotten who he was? And I'm actually bored by a lot of biographies. You know, there are interesting passages, and then there are long stretches where you just don't want to hear it. Like, why do I need to know about every course they took in high school, or their first girlfriend, or their second girlfriend, or their second boyfriend? So I didn't know how to get through it. And I literally heard a voice in my head while I was driving one day, an unusual event for me, that said, Holbrooke, yes, I knew him. Just popped into my head. I had no idea whose voice it was, why it was there, where it came from. But what I knew was, for the first time, I felt excited, because this was a voice that had like a personality, energy, a point of view. And I began to imagine a narrator who isn't really me. And so the narrator of this book is the only thing I made up. Everything else is scrupulously fact-checked. And there's not a single line in it that is consciously false. But the voice of the narrator is not my voice. So when he says, Holbrooke, yes, I knew him, it's as if some old colleague has been asked, did you know Holbrooke? Yes, I knew him. And the rest of the book is like the yarn that you've asked to hear about Holbrooke. I didn't know him like the narrator knew him. I got to know him by interviewing 250 people and reading through all those filing cabinets, but there's no trace of that in the book. You don't hear about my interviews, you don't hear about my research. You hear the story as if a narrator who somehow just knows the story is telling you a very long, nice yarn about Holbrooke because you asked. So there's a lot of direct address of the reader as if you're sitting there, and a breaking of the fourth wall, as you said, Max. And so the first chapter begins, do you mind if we hurry through the early years? And a lot of people said, I was so grateful when I read that. Because sometimes you really do. I mean, sometimes the early years are the best, but I think with Holbrooke, you kind of want to hurry through them. So I gave myself that freedom by inventing a voice that could say that, and that you would then kind of get used to talking to you that way, and you'd give a lot of license to. And then at other times, it slows down, and you stop hearing the narrator so much, and you're following Holbrooke through scenes almost cinematically. So it just gave me a tremendous freedom to change the pace, to move closer, to move further back, to address the reader, to talk about Vietnam without having to give an entire potted history of the war. And that gave me kind of the zest, which is Holbrooke's zest. It was like equal to Holbrooke. It was a level of energy that I could bring to it because he had so much energy. I needed that kind of language in order to do justice to him.
Have you read Somerset Maugham and his short stories in particular? I'm just curious because you raised that literary device, and that was, of course, the way that Somerset Maugham frames so many of his stories as a tale told to him by somebody else, and he becomes kind of the person who's hearing it and becomes a character in his own story.
I've read Maugham, but I had two different models. One was Fitzgerald with Nick Carraway telling you the story of Gatsby, and the other is Conrad with Marlowe, his sailor narrator, telling you the story of Kurtz or of Lord Jim. But you're right that it was kind of an older, late Victorian device that you need some conceit that allows you to tell the story. And the conceit is someone, you've asked a question, did you know Holbrooke? And that prompts the story. And so you have the illusion that you're hearing it from a person rather than from this omniscient, invisible, and rather boring biographer, which is what I was dreading.
Let me ask you about your attitude towards Holbrooke, because the book certainly presents a mixed picture. This is far from a hagiography, but nor is it a hit job. It's somewhere in the middle. And I will just quote a few sentences here where you note that, among other things, he was a monstrous egotist who once told a colleague, "I lost more money in the market today than you make in a year," or bumped an elderly survivor couple from the official American bus to Auschwitz on the 50th anniversary of its liberation, adding himself to the delegation alongside Elie Wiesel, and left the weeping couple to beg Polish guards to let them into the camp so they wouldn't miss the ceremony, or how he lobbied for the Nobel Peace Prize, that kind of thing, all the time, as if he needed to discharge a surplus of self every few hours to maintain his equilibrium. So that's not exactly fawning coverage of him, and yet you do give him credit for ending the Bosnian War, something that was a tremendous good for the world, and you give him a lot of credit for good intentions and for being a champion of American ideals and American diplomacy and American power in a positive, often in a positive way. So this is obviously, very, very mixed, but I'd be curious for your own thoughts on how you sorted the good and the bad out when it came to Holbrooke.
I mean, I thought about him as a character, as a man in full. And when you really see someone that way, you come to realize that you cannot sort them out. You can't say, well, if we could just pull some of these really unfortunate traits like bumping Holocaust survivors off the bus to Auschwitz, and if we could just get him to be a little more restrained and stop moving around the cards at the dinner table so that he could seat himself next to the most important guest, and give him a little self-awareness, which he did not have, then he could have done anything, right? He would not have gotten in his own way. He would not have alienated Barack Obama. He might have become Secretary of State. But the more you think about it, the more you realize that impulse to move around the cards at a dinner table is the same impulse, relentlessness, drive, shamelessness, that pushed Slobodan Milosevic to the brink and forced him to give up his dream of Greater Serbia, which no other diplomat had been able to do. And the only reason Bill Clinton and Warren Christopher really disliked Holbrooke, he was the Secretary of State at the time, let Holbrooke be the man to do this was because they knew that he had exactly the qualities that could get it done. But those were the same qualities that destroyed his best friendship and his first marriage and alienated so many of his colleagues in Washington. So many interviews began with the person telling me a horrible story, like they'd been just chewing on it for years, and finally someone came up and said, "Did you know Holbrooke?" Puh! Yeah, I knew him. Here you go. Stick that in your book. So I just think they are inseparable qualities, and if you tried to fix him, you would kill the engine that made him do some pretty great things.
I mean, he was such a smart guy, and he could be so charismatic and charming, and as you, I think, put it very well, that if he thought you were interesting but not a threat, he would be, joyful in your company.
Yes.
We probably both fell into that category of perhaps interesting but not a threat to him. But
Yes.
why was somebody who was so smart and so perceptive in so many ways, so charismatic, sometimes so charming, why was he so oblivious to the effect that he had on people and how he turned off so many people?
Yeah.
And especially when it was so obvious that he was trying to cultivate them and he was too obsequious. And you quote Les Gelb, my former boss and Holbrooke's dearest friend, saying, Dick, stop kissing up to people. It's too much. You've got to stop kissing ass. I'm sorry for the
and
the
Holbrooke
language.
would say, what am I doing? What are you talking about?
Right.
And he was blind to himself. And that, I can't explain it. I don't have a psychological theory. There's no rosebud moment from his childhood that explains everything. I think he was himself from the beginning, but to be himself was to be unable to see himself, to laugh at himself. You couldn't tease him, and to see the effect he was having on other people. So Gelb would say, what's Obama like? And Holbrooke would analyze the president brilliantly. And then Gelb would say, okay, how do you affect Obama? And Holbrooke had no idea. So I'll tell a quick story. The first time he met Obama was just after the election in 2008. Holbrooke was very close to Hillary Clinton and had been on her campaign. So he was not welcome in Obama's circle. In fact, he had made two enemies who were Obama's top advisors, Susan Rice and Anthony Lake. But Obama knew that he needed the talent of the earlier generation. So he invited Holbrooke to Chicago to transition headquarters to interview him. And within a minute, Holbrooke made 3 mistakes. The first thing he did was he handed Obama a signed copy of his own book on Bosnia, which I think of as kind of a misdemeanor and a typical Washington thing. But for Obama, that's like, no, you don't immediately start trying to impress this, if you have a sense of who Obama is. Second thing he did was to say, Mr. President, could you call me Richard, not Dick? My wife prefers for people to use Richard with me. So he corrected Obama. And the third thing he did was he began to tear up. I think it was genuine. And he said, Mr. President, you don't need to be African American to cry. Meaning, I'm overcome with emotion to be with our first black president. And anyone who understood Obama knew that that was exactly the wrong thing to do, because he wanted to talk about foreign policy and not to see a display of. So I think within a minute, Holbrooke had lost Obama. He never got him back. And in these Situation Room meetings, Holbrooke would lecture Obama, flatter him, pontificate, sound as if he was writing the first draft of his memoirs. And it drove Obama crazy. And he told Jim Jones, his national security advisor, I don't want him to be in the Oval Office. If he's going to be in the Situation Room, he has to keep it short. I just don't want to be with him. And for 2 years, Holbrooke was cut out and undermined and humiliated. And so those last 2 years were the unhappiest of his life. I partly blame Obama for not just seeing that he could use this man, because there was tremendous experience and talent. But I also blame Holbrooke, because that blindness kept him from seeing, just don't do it. It's not working. And he had such faith in his own powers of charm and persuasion that he didn't understand that he'd lost Obama.
Do you think that either Clinton or Obama should have appointed Holbrooke Secretary of State?
I think he had all the talent and the energy and just the will to solve problems of a great Secretary of State. He would not have been buttoned down and cautious like Warren Christopher. He would not have been, a very successful public figure, but not particularly strategic-minded or interested in actual creative diplomacy. And I would say that describes Hillary Clinton. He would have really tried to get involved in all the problems of the world. But he would have done it in a way that alienated everyone around him. Bill Clinton almost named him Secretary of State in 1996 after Dayton. Holbrooke was at the height of his reputation. The other contender was Madeleine Albright. And he went back and forth, and finally Clinton said to Al Gore, I found this in Strobe Talbot's diaries. Clinton said to Gore, "I just don't think he has the self-awareness to keep his relationships from becoming toxic." I think that's a pretty sharp insight from a man who maybe it took one to know one. But so he passed up Holbrooke, and Holbrooke kept missing that brass ring time after time. And the reason was no president could really trust him to just keep it under wraps enough to be able to sit in the cabinet meeting or in the Situation Room or in the Oval Office without driving everybody crazy.
I think one of the great revelations of your book, and I learned an awful lot from it about Holbrooke, one of the great revelations concerns his relationship with Tony Lake. Now, who was Tony Lake, and what was the nature of Holbrooke's relationship with him?
So this is like, to me, Burr and Hamilton level of in just a twisted, long. They were doomed to be intertwined from the start to the end of their lives. They met in '62. They entered the Foreign Service together. They were the bright stars. They went to Vietnam together. They were best friends. They played a lot of tennis in the heat of Saigon. This seemed to be the way that Holbrooke he also played with Westmoreland and with Maxwell Taylor and finally with Bobby Kennedy back in Washington. He used tennis to network. But over time, the relationship began to get a bit frayed because Lake was exactly the opposite. He was restrained, decorous, a gentleman, but also repressed and judgmental and a wasp to Holbrooke's being a Jew, but a Jew who didn't really cop to being a Jew. They were so opposite in so many ways, and it all blew up when, and I guess should I spoil the surprise? Holbrooke tried to run away with Lake's wife. And this was something that nobody outside a group of maybe 3 people knew for decades. I kind of figured it out in my research. This is where biography feels like a kind of shameful enterprise. I sort of heard a hint of it from someone who knew him. I asked Les Gelb directly. He lied, the only lie he ever told me to protect his friend, because this was a line that Holbrooke crossed that is just unforgivable. His best friend's wife. She didn't go off with him, but she was tempted because she was having a bit of trouble in her marriage. I finally got it out of the first Mrs. Holbrooke, who was the victim of all of this, because this led to the end of their marriage. This was around 71, 72. So I think Tony Lake wanted to believe that he got over it, because Tony Lake is a gentleman and a very decent man. But who gets over that? You don't. And for the next 3 decades, the friendship turned into a tense relationship. They were working together all the time. And finally, during the Clinton years, when they were both doing Bosnia, Holbrooke from the State Department, Lake as Clinton's national security advisor, both of them in very top jobs, they were mortal enemies. And Holbrooke's diary is full of venomous observations about Lake and meetings in the Oval Office where they are kind of, both of them like this, and you feel like it might erupt right in front of Bill Clinton. And Clinton once asked an advisor, what the hell happened between Lake and Holbrooke? Because everyone knew that there was something wrong and no one knew what it was. But now they know.
Now, one of the themes, or one of the major themes of the book is, in fact, Holbrooke's womanizing, which this is not just a diplomatic narrative. This is not just about his official duties, but you also get into his personal life, including with Tony Lake's first wife, but just in general. Was that, did you hesitate at all in writing about that, or did you know that had to be a big part of the story?
I mean, this is not a foreign policy book. This is a character study set against a really interesting epic in American history. So how do you write a character study without having the man in full? Do you just bring the reader right up to the bedroom door and then say, I'm sorry, but we're not going to open that door? I think you have to be aware of your own prurient impulses. We all have them. and try to keep them in check. But you also have an obligation to the reader. I think that is the first obligation, not to the subject, not to the sources who you interview, but to the reader. If the reader needs to know this in order to understand why this friendship turned poisonous to the detriment of American foreign policy, how do you not tell that story? So just as you can't disassemble Holbrooke like an engine and try to fix him, you can't take parts of his life and put a blanket over them in order to hide them from the reader. It's all of a piece, and you need to have the whole thing.
And how has the account been received by his family, also by some of the women from his past, but his kids and others? I mean, what's been the reaction?
Well, I think the most important is Kati, his third wife and widow, who gave me his papers and who gave me help along the way by telling people to talk to me, by talking to me herself. But she also had an interest, I mean, a very real and powerful interest, and I felt the pressure of that interest a lot of the time and had to try to insulate myself a bit from it. And I knew that when she saw the book, there would be a moment, or more than a moment, of real emotion, and I didn't know how it would go between us. So I gave it to her at the end of the manuscript process, before it was too late to make changes. The cement was still wet. Why did I do that? I didn't promise her I would make any changes, but I felt I owed her that chance because she had made it possible for me to write the book by giving me his papers. And I just had my heart in my throat for like the 2 days that I knew she was reading it. And finally, an email came. I was driving. I handed my phone to my wife to read it. And she said, "I think I should read it to you." And I said, "No, don't." Because I just thought, this is going to be terrible. She's going to hate it. She's going to tell me I have to change everything. She's going to tell me I betrayed her. It's all, Janet Malcolm has written books about the relationship between writers and subjects and what kind of fraught things go on between them. And instead, she let me know that it had hurt, that she had cried a lot, that it had kind of slayed her, but that she respected and admired it, and that she accepted it as my book. And I thought that was a gift that was even greater than the papers. And I really admire her for that. So, I mean, it's been rocky a little bit, but that's the fundamental thing. She's a writer, and she let me be the writer of this book.
Right. That actually sounds pretty familiar, because I had almost the exact same experience writing about Ed Lansdale, the subject of my book, The Road Not Taken, where, again, a huge part of the book is about his love affair with this Filipino woman who was his longtime mistress, eventually became his second wife. And so I was able to get their love letters from Pat Kelly, this is the Filipino woman, from her granddaughter, but at the same time I got a lot of cooperation from Ed Lansdale's kids, Pete and Ed, and of course they were aware that Pat Kelly existed, but they didn't realize I had the love letters. They didn't realize I was going to go into great depth on their relationship.
Yeah.
And of course they provided me some of the letters that they had themselves, and I wanted cooperation from them, but I had that same exact experience when I sent a draft of my book when it was done to them, and I was like hiding under the table waiting to see what the reaction would be, because I was petrified as you were that they would hit the roof and denounce it and be furious that I was going into their personal relationship. But they were actually remarkably calm about it as well, and a kind of I think accepting of the contradictions and the good and the bad of their father.
I mean, there's something a little immoral about what we do. Janet Malcolm wrote a book called The Silent Woman about Sylvia Plath, but it's really about biography. And there's a paragraph in it describing biographers as being like burglars who break into the house of the subject and rifle through the drawers and the dresser and look for the jewelry and pocket it and take it home, and then are praised by the public for their industrious research and for how much material they managed to get by burglarizing the house of someone who wasn't there to defend it. And you have to be careful. And this is where, how do you weigh the good against the bad? You have to be very careful not to turn your biography into a trial where you are there essentially to prosecute and convict the subject. Because the record of anyone's life is so full of embarrassments, of betrayals, of lies, and when you're really digging, they're just coming up all the time. And which of us could withstand that kind of scrutiny? I would not want anyone to think of writing a biography because I don't want that kind of scrutiny, because I don't think I could hold up to it very well. None of us could. So when you have that power, you have to treat it with a lot of care. And part of the care is to see the person whole and to imagine life through their eyes and not to be outside them saying, caught you in another lie. This indictment is getting very long. It's kind of an unfair way to approach it.
One of the themes of the book that really resonated with me, in addition to the complexity of Holbrooke and trying to present his life in full, is there's a kind of elegiac tone for American power. You're kind of nostalgic for the heyday of American influence, which you see Holbrooke representing. And so tell me what that feels like. There's a sense that you're writing from the post-American era, which we're more or less entering now, and obviously a president who harks back to a very different America First tradition, whereas Holbrooke always believed in American power, the goodness of American power. And some people even, I think, criticized you for being too positive in your depiction of American power in the way that Holbrooke wielded it.
Yeah, that baffled me a little, because this is a book that begins in Vietnam and ends in Afghanistan. And so the picture of American power is decidedly mixed. And the disasters that our impulse to make the world better are right there in front of you. I see that period, which is Holbrooke's life. He was born in 41, the year we entered World War II and became a global superpower, and the year that Henry Luce coined the phrase, the American century. And he died in 2010, which is sometime around, I think, the period when we were no longer in that place. We thought we could do anything. That's Holbrooke's phrase, and that's Holbrooke about himself and about America. Not only could we, but we must. And that impulse led to the Marshall Plan. It led to Vietnam. It led to the end of the Bosnian War, and it led to Iraq and Afghanistan. So I don't think the ledger is entirely on one side or the other, but I'm sympathetic to Holbrooke's sense of responsibility. He felt that without an American leadership role, the world's problems would get worse, no one else would be able to solve them, and eventually they would become our problems. And that was kind of the Holbrooke worldview in a nutshell, and maybe the best description of how American foreign policy saw its role between those years. So, and it's history now. That's my main feeling, is that when the 2016 election came, that was the week I began writing, I suddenly felt, okay, the story's over. We're in something new now. This is not Holbrooke's time. In fact, he wouldn't recognize it. And that made it a little easier to write this as a story, because it was over.
Can I actually, we only have a few minutes remaining, but can I just very briefly switch gears and ask you about your fascinating acceptance for the Hitchens Prize, which you recently received, and you wrote this up in The Atlantic, and it's a great essay, which I would commend to anybody who is interested in our current intellectual debate. But one of the central points you make is this notion that belonging is the enemy of good writing, and I wonder if you could explain what you mean by that.
So the speech I gave when I received the prize, I turned into a kind of discussion of what are the enemies of writing today. And the first one I listed was belonging, and what I meant by that was the sense that a writer should write as a representative of some larger interest or group or identity. And that could be race or gender, that could be political faction, it could be all kinds of things. And it's almost a given now for young writers that they have to write as a something. And I think it's almost the opposite of writing in order to reach people especially people unlike you. If you're writing on behalf of your own group, you're not reaching people who are not in your group. And what's more, if you're writing as a representative, you're checking yourself, you're censoring yourself, you're asking yourself, will this make my allies unhappy? Will it help my enemies? Will it get me into trouble on Twitter? These are all ways of thinking that are terrible for writers because you're censoring yourself, which is in some ways more insidious than state censorship because it's in your head. The thought police, you carry them around with you everywhere. And once you don't allow certain thoughts to take their course, you stop thinking them and you stop writing them. And your writing begins to turn a bit lifeless because it doesn't have the energy of a new thought and even a daring thought. So my feeling is writers write as themselves, which is to say an individual trying to cross the unfathomable gap that separates all of us from one another. And if you get away too much from that idea of a writer, you end up being something more like a spokesperson. And to me, that's the opposite of a good writer.
Do you feel like these sentiments are actually stifling free speech?
Yeah, I do. I do. It's not the state. It's not the threat of assassination by an extremist group. They're out there, but so far at least, our writers seem to be pretty safe. The enemy is yourself, which is the most dangerous enemy because you can't get away from him or her. And I see it all the time in journalism, in books, in politics. I see a fear of telling people what they don't want to hear. And that's the opposite of free speech. Free speech is the right to tell people what they don't want to hear.
And do you feel like the threat comes from the left or the right, both?
I mean, when I published that speech in The Atlantic, I was told by the left that I was blaming them, and I was told by the right that I shouldn't blame them. I think it's both. I mean, in my world, which is the world of media and books and journalism, it's a liberal world, and I see a great deal of self-censorship. But I look at our political figures, and I see a great deal of doublethink and self-censorship on the right, where facts are denied and what everyone can see is not there, and people are afraid to get on the wrong side of their faction. So I see it kind of everywhere right now. That's why I decided that I should talk about it, even though I got a bit of flack for it.
I think it was a brave and necessary essay, which again I commend. I think it really is a valuable addition to the public debate. And with that, let me wind up this fascinating session with a plea to all of you to go out and buy this book, and you will not be disappointed. It's really a terrific read, and it really reads like a novel about this larger than life character. I mean, it's hard to believe he really existed. And again, I knew Holbrooke, and I learned a tremendous amount about him. All these things I had no idea about. It was like, oh my goodness, a revelation on every page. And just to emphasize and to go back to where we were starting, just tremendously well written, and I think really innovative in the way that you captured him. And I really felt the man coming off the page, which is the highest tribute I can pay to any biography.
Thanks so much. I'm really grateful.
You.
Thank you, Max.